Malcolm Carter reached into the $300,000 McLaren, ripped the diagnostic cable clean out of the dashboard, and hurled it across the concrete floor. 20 of the world's finest engineers had trusted that machine. Every last one of them had been dead wrong. "You've been chasing a ghost for 6 months," he said, wiping grease across his forehead. "This engine was never broken." Victoria Sterling, the billionaire CEO who'd flown specialists in from 2 continents, went white as paper. Because if a single black father with a rusted toolbox was right then, everything she believed about money, brains, and worth was a lie. Before we go further, drop the city you're watching from in the comments so I can see how far Malcolm's story travels tonight. And if you believe real talent never needs anybody's permission, hit subscribe and stay with me. Malcolm Carter reached into the open door of the McLaren, wrapped his hand around the diagnostic cable that 20 engineers had sworn by, and yanked it out by the root. The plastic clip cracked. The cable whipped across the garage and landed near a coffee can full of bolts. 6 months, Malcolm said, straightening up slow, one hand pressed to the small of his back. 6 months of the smartest men in the country staring at a screen, and not one of you ever put your hand on the block and just felt it. Nobody answered him, because nobody in that garage believed he had the right to talk that way. There were 4 engineers standing behind Victoria Sterling that morning. Men in pressed shirts with lanyards around their necks and titles that took 2 lines to print. They had flown in from Munich, from Detroit, from a laboratory in England that only serviced cars worth more than most houses. And they were staring at Malcolm Carter the way people stare at a man who has just said something they know can't be true. Victoria stood in the middle of them with her arms folded across her coat, and she was the only one who wasn't smiling that thin, private smile the others wore. "You're telling me," she said carefully, "that 4 separate teams, every one of them certified by the factory, spent half a year and a great deal of my money, and they were all wrong." "No, ma'am," Malcolm said. "I'm telling you they were all looking at the same lie. And when everybody's looking at the same lie, they call it the truth." One of the engineers, a tall one named Prescott, the one from England, let out a short breath through his nose. "This is remarkable," he said to no one in particular. "We're going to take mechanical advice from a man who works out of a garage with a hand-painted sign." Malcolm turned and looked at him. He didn't get angry. Malcolm Carter had stopped getting angry at men like Prescott a long time ago, because anger cost him energy, and he had a 7-year-old at home who needed that energy more than Prescott deserved it. "You want to know what the sign says?" Malcolm asked him. Prescott didn't answer. "It says, Carter and Son. My daddy painted it. He's been dead 9 years and I still haven't taken his name off it because the day I do is the day I forget who taught me how to listen to an engine instead of just reading about one." He wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his belt. "Now, you can stand there and laugh, or you can come look at what I found. But you can't do both. I don't have room in my shop for both." Let me back up, because to understand what Malcolm Carter did that night, you have to understand where he was standing before any billionaire ever pulled up to his door. Malcolm was 41 years old. He'd been fixing cars since he was 11 first, as the boy who handed his father wrenches, then as the teenager who did the jobs. His father's hands got too tired to do, and finally, as the man who took over the shop the week after they buried him. He had grease worked so deep into the creases of his knuckles that no soap on earth would ever get it out. He wore the same 3 work shirts on rotation, washed thin at the elbows. He drove a 14-year-old truck with a check engine light he could have fixed in 10 minutes, but never bothered to, because he knew exactly what was wrong with it, and it wasn't worth his time. And he was raising his daughter Ava alone. Her mother had passed 3 years before. Malcolm didn't talk about it much. When customers asked the ones who noticed the little girl doing homework in the office chair, or the drawings taped up behind the register, he'd just say, "It's me and her now," and change the subject to whatever brought them in. He wasn't a man who wore his grief where people could see it. His father had taught him that too. You carry it. You don't set it down on other people's counters. Every single morning, Malcolm was up at 5. He'd make Ava's lunch and cut the crusts off the way she liked, even though she was getting old enough now to tell him she didn't care about the crusts anymore. She said it just to sound grown, and he'd smile and cut them off anyway. He'd walk her to the bus stop on the corner, wait until the doors folded shut, and she waved at him through the window, and then he'd open the shop. And most days, the shop wasn't kind to him. It wasn't the work. The work was the one honest thing in Malcolm's life. It was the people. Because there was a certain kind of customer who walked into Carter & Son, looked at Malcolm's shirt, looked at his tools, looked at the neighborhood. The shop sat in the old brick buildings, the cracked lot, the south side of a city that most rich folks only saw from the highway, and decided before Malcolm ever opened his mouth exactly what he was worth. There was the man last spring who brought in a German sedan and stood over Malcolm's shoulder the whole time, asking him if he was sure he'd worked on this kind of car before, even after Malcolm told him twice that he'd rebuilt 3 of that exact model that same year. There was the woman who called ahead to ask if there was a supervisor she could speak to, and when Malcolm told her she was speaking to the owner, went quiet, and then asked if the owner had any certifications. Malcolm had more certifications than most dealership techs. They hung on the wall behind him. She never came in to see them. There was the young man in the nice watch who paid, took his keys, and said, "Thanks, buddy," in a way that landed like a hand patting the top of a dog's head. Malcolm swallowed all of it. Not because it didn't cut. It cut every single time a man doesn't get numb to being told he's less, no matter how many times he hears it. He swallowed it because he had a daughter to feed, and a mortgage on the building, and a name over the door he refused to let anybody drag down. His father had a saying for it. Whenever a customer treated him like he was small, the old man would wait until they left, and then he'd look at Malcolm and say the same thing every time. "They don't know what they're looking at, son, that's all. They just don't know what they're looking at." Malcolm had spent his whole life being something people didn't know how to look at. Now, the McLaren. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday. Malcolm was under an old pickup when the office phone rang, and he almost didn't crawl out to get it because the caller ID showed a number with too many zeros in it to be anybody he knew. But he crawled out because he always crawled out. You never knew when a call was. The call that made rent, and he wiped his hand and picked it up. Carter & Son. "Am I speaking with Malcolm Carter?" A woman's voice. Clipped. Careful. The voice of somebody who was used to other people doing the waiting. "You are. My name is Victoria Sterling. I'm the chief executive of Sterling Automotive Technologies." She paused, like the name was supposed to do something to him. "Okay," Malcolm said. There was a small silence on the line. She wasn't used to okay. She was used to, "Oh." "I have a car," she went on, "that I have been unable to repair. It's a McLaren. It's not an ordinary vehicle, and it's not an ordinary situation. I've had it looked at by a great many people." "How many's a great many, you mean?" "Over 20 specialists, 4 different teams." Another pause, and this one had something underneath it, something she wasn't saying. "Including the factory." Malcolm leaned against the doorframe of the office and looked out at Ava, who was sitting at the little desk in the corner, doing long division, tongue poking out the side of her mouth, the way it always did when she concentrated. "And they all told you the same thing," he said. "Yes, they told me it can't be fixed." "But you don't believe them." The line went quiet again, longer this time. And when Victoria Sterling spoke, some of the polish had come off her voice, and Malcolm heard for just a second a person instead of a title. "No," she said. "I don't." "Why not?" "Because—" she started, and then she stopped herself, and Malcolm could almost hear her deciding not to tell him the real reason. "Because I don't accept that some problems don't have answers. That's how I built what I built. Someone gave me your name. They said if there was a man alive who could hear something in an engine that a computer couldn't, it was you." A short, dry laugh. Frankly, it sounded like superstition. "It is," Malcolm said, "and it isn't." "What does that mean?" "It means bring me the car, Ms. Sterling. I'll tell you what it's trying to say." He heard her breathe out. He could tell she almost said something sharp, almost told him not to be so sure of himself, and then thought better of it, because the truth was, she had nothing left to lose. She'd already lost to the best in the world. What was one more loss to a man with a hand-painted sign? "It'll be there tomorrow morning," she said. 9 o'clock. "I open at 7. 9, she said, is when I'll be there," and she hung up. Malcolm set the phone down and stood there a minute. Ava looked up from her math. "Who was that, Daddy?" "A lady with a broken car, baby." "Can you fix it?" Malcolm smiled at her, that tired, warm smile he saved just for his girl. "Don't know yet. Gotta hear it first." She nodded like that made perfect sense. Because to Ava, it did. Her whole life, her daddy had fixed everything. The wobbly kitchen table, her bike chain, the nightlight that flickered, the zipper on her backpack. To a 7-year-old, there was no such thing as a thing her father couldn't fix, and Malcolm knew he was living on borrowed time before the world taught her different. He just wanted to hold that off as long as he could. The McLaren came the next morning on a covered flatbed, strapped down like a body being moved in secret. 2 black SUVs came with it. Out of the first one climbed the 4 engineers. Out of the second came Victoria Sterling. Malcolm had seen her picture. Ava had looked her up on the office computer the night before, and announced with great authority that, "She's famous, Daddy, she's got a whole page." But pictures didn't tell you how a person carried themselves, and Victoria Sterling carried herself like the ground was lucky to have her walking on it. She wore a long charcoal coat that probably cost more than Malcolm cleared in a good month. She looked at his shop, the cracked lot, the faded sign, the tire display that had been sun-bleached to the color of dust, and Malcolm watched her whole face do the thing he'd watched 1,000 faces do. She decided what he was worth, right there, in under 2 seconds. "Mr. Carter," she said, walking toward him with her hand out, and to her credit, she did shake his hand, grease and all, though he saw her glance down at it first. "Ms. Sterling." Behind her, Prescott, the English engineer, was already looking around the garage with an expression like he'd stepped in something. "You keep your tools organized," Prescott said. It was not a compliment. It was a man surprised that a place like this had any order in it at all. "I do," Malcolm said. "My daddy used to say a messy shop is a messy mind." "Charming," Prescott said, and turned away. Victoria didn't laugh, but she didn't stop him either. That told Malcolm most of what he needed to know about how the next few days were going to go. They wheeled the McLaren in off the flatbed. Even Malcolm, who had spent his whole life around machines and swore he'd stopped being impressed by any of them, felt something catch in his chest looking at it. It was a beautiful piece of engineering. Low and long and mean, painted a blue so deep it looked black until the light hit it. It was the kind of car that a man like Malcolm was only ever supposed to see going the other way on the highway. Not sitting in his own garage. Not waiting for his hands. "Before you touch it," Prescott said, stepping between Malcolm and the car with a thick binder in his hands, "you should read the reports. All of them. 4 teams. Every diagnostic run 3 times to confirm. I'd hate for you to waste the lady's time reinventing conclusions we reached months ago." Malcolm looked at the binder. Then he looked at Prescott. "You mind if I ask you something first?" Prescott sighed. "If you must. Have you ever one time in your life fixed a car with your own 2 hands, not designed it? Not diagnosed it on a screen? Actually laid down under it and got dirty and turned a wrench till your knuckles bled?" Prescott's jaw tightened. "I have a doctorate in mechanical engineering from—" "That's a no," Malcolm said gently. He wasn't being cruel. He was almost being kind. "See, that's your whole binder right there. Y'all read the car. You never once listened to it. Oh, for God's sake." Prescott turned to Victoria. "This is exactly what I warned you about. This is folk medicine. This is a man who's going to tell us the engine has a spirit in it." And that was when Victoria Sterling surprised everybody in the room, including herself. "Let him work," she said. Prescott blinked. "Ms. Sterling, I said let him work." She turned to Malcolm, and for just a moment there was something in her face that wasn't the CEO and wasn't the woman who'd decided what he was worth in 2 seconds flat. It was something almost like desperation dressed up in a very expensive coat. "You have until tomorrow morning. If you find nothing, Then I'll accept that the car is what they say it is, and I'll thank you for your time, and I'll pay you for it, and I'll never bother you again. But you'll have your night, alone with it. Is that what you want? Yes, ma'am, Malcolm said. That's exactly what I want. Why alone? Malcolm looked at the McLaren, then back at her. Because a machine won't tell you the truth with a crowd standing around it. Same as a person won't. You want the truth out of anything, you gotta get it by itself, and you gotta be quiet, and you gotta stop telling it what you already think is wrong with it. He shrugged. Your engineers walked in already knowing the answer. That's why they never found one. Victoria stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something that made Prescott's mouth fall open. She reached into her coat, pulled out a business card, wrote a number on the back of it, and handed it to Malcolm. That's my private line, she said. Not the office, mine. If you find something in the night, you call it. I don't care what hour it is. Yes, ma'am. She gathered her engineers with a look and moved toward the door. Prescott lingered a second, leaned in toward Malcolm, and dropped his voice so only he could hear it. You're going to embarrass yourself, Prescott said. And when you do, I want you to remember that I gave you the chance to walk away with your dignity. Malcolm looked at him with those calm, tired eyes. Mister, he said, I've been embarrassed by better men than you in nicer clothes than that for reasons a lot dumber than a car. You ain't gonna be the one that finally does it. Prescott didn't have an answer for that. He straightened up, buttoned his coat, and walked out. And then it was just Malcolm and the McLaren, and the sound of the door swinging shut. Well, almost. Daddy. Ava was standing in the office doorway in her socks holding the stuffed rabbit she still slept with, even though she told people at school she didn't. It was past her bedtime. Malcolm had set up the little cot in the office years ago for nights when the work ran long and there was nobody to watch her, which was most nights. Hey, baby, he said. You supposed to be asleep. I heard the fancy car. She patted over and stood next to him, looking up at the McLaren with enormous eyes. It's the prettiest one I ever saw. Is it the lady with the whole page? It's hers, yeah. Are you gonna fix it? Malcolm crouched down so he was level with her. This was the part of his life that nobody like Prescott ever saw. The engineer saw a man in a worn-out shirt. Victoria Sterling saw a gamble she was too proud to walk away from. But nobody saw this, a father down on one knee at 10 o'clock at night, talking to a little girl who thought he could fix the whole world. You know what those smart men told the lady? Malcolm said. They told her nobody could fix it. 20 of them. From all over. Ava's brow furrowed. But you can, though. Why do you think I can when they all said no? She thought about it the way she thought about everything seriously, with her whole small face. Because, she said finally, when everybody says you can't, that's when you always do. Malcolm felt something go tight in his throat, because that was true. That was the truest thing anybody had said in that garage all day, and it came out of a 7-year-old in mismatched socks. His whole life had been, everybody says, you can't. Every customer who looked past him, every teacher who'd told him he wasn't college material, every loan officer who'd found a reason to say no, every man in a nice coat who patted him on the head. His whole life had been people deciding before he ever got a chance that the answer was no. And every good thing he'd ever built, he'd built out of proving that no wrong. Come here, he said, and he pulled her into a hug, grease shirt and all, and she wrapped her little arms around his neck. You go on and lie down now. Daddy's gonna be up a while. But I want you to know something. What? He held her back at arm's length so she could see his face. No matter what those men said, no matter what that lady thinks when she looks at our shop, you and me, we're not less than anybody. You understand me, not less than a single soul that walked through that door today. We might not have what they got, but there ain't a person alive worth more than my little girl. You got that? Ava nodded solemnly. I got that. Say it back to me. We're not less than anybody. That's right. He kissed the top of her head. Now go to sleep. And in the morning, that pretty car's gonna be running. You just watch. Promise. Malcolm should not have promised. A wise man doesn't promise a thing he hasn't done yet. 20 experts had said it was impossible. The factory itself had given up. Every reasonable bone in his body told him not to make that promise to a child who would believe it with her whole heart. But he looked at her face, and he thought about his father's voice. "They don't know what they're looking at, son." And he thought about all the years of being told no, and something in him just refused. "I promise," he said. Ava smiled the smile that was the only thing in the world that had gotten Malcolm through the last 3 years, and she padded back to the cot. And a few minutes later, her breathing went slow and even, and Malcolm Carter was alone with a $300,000 machine that the smartest people on Earth had given up on. He didn't touch it right away. He pulled up his stool, the old wooden one with the wobbly leg his father used to sit on, and he set it down about 6 feet from the front of the car, and he just sat there and looked at it. For a long time. Longer than any of those engineers would have believed a serious professional could sit and do nothing. But he wasn't doing nothing. He was letting go of everything he'd been told. That was the thing Prescott would never understand, not with all his degrees. When you walk up to a broken machine already carrying 20 other men's answers in your head, you can't hear anything but their answers. Their voices get in the way. So Malcolm sat, and one by one, he set their conclusions down. The factory report, the Munich team, Prescott's fat binder. He set all of it on the floor of his mind, and he stepped over it until the only thing left in his head was the car itself, sitting there in the quiet, keeping its secret. Then he got up and he opened the driver's door, and he did something none of the 20 had done. He got in, and he just sat behind the wheel, hands on it, feet on the pedals, feeling the car the way a rider feels a horse before he ever asks it to move. His father had taught him that too. Before you fix a man's car, sit in it. You learn things about a machine from the seat that you'll never learn from the hood. And sitting there in the dark with his daughter asleep 20 feet away and a billionaire's private number in his shirt pocket, Malcolm Carter felt the first thread of the truth. He reached out and pressed the start button. The dash lit up like the Christmas tree. Warnings, errors, faults, a whole cascade of them, one on top of the other, more red than he'd ever seen a car throw at once. To anybody reading that screen, it looked like a machine dying 100 deaths at the same time. Engine fault, fuel fault, transmission fault, sensor fault, fault all the way down. And that was the exact moment Malcolm knew. Not because of what the screen said, because of what he heard. Underneath all those warnings, in the half second before the system shut everything down, Malcolm heard the engine try to turn over. And it wasn't the sound of a dying machine. It was the sound of a strong, healthy engine that had been told it was dying and was fighting to prove it wasn't, and was being shut down before it ever got the chance. He'd heard that sound before, in people mostly. Malcolm sat back and let out a slow breath, and if you'd been there, you'd have seen the corner of his mouth turn up just barely for the first time all day. "There you are," he said quietly to the car. "You're not sick at all, are you? Somebody just told you that you were, and you believed it, and everybody else believed it too." He shook his head slow. "Lord, you're just like the rest of us. Because here's what 20 of the finest engineers in the world, with all their degrees and their diagnostic machines and their fat binders, had failed to grasp. And here is the thing that would, before this story was over, bring a billionaire CEO to tears in a garage on the south side of the city. A machine will tell you everything is broken, when the one small thing that's supposed to tell the truth about it is the thing that's broken. Malcolm didn't call Victoria's private line, not yet. He knew what it was now, or he was close to knowing, but knowing and proving are two different animals, and he'd promised his little girl a running car by morning, not a theory. So he rolled up his sleeves and he pulled his light down on its long cord, and he went to work in the quiet alone, the way he'd worked 10,000 nights before this one. No audience, no approval, no permission from a single living soul. Just a man and his hands and the truth waiting inside the machine for somebody, anybody to finally get quiet enough to hear it. The clock on the office wall said 11:40. Ava's breathing was soft and steady in the dark. And Malcolm Carter, the man. 20 experts had laughed at the man a billionaire had decided about in 2 seconds flat, The man the world had spent 41 years telling no leaned into the engine bay of the impossible car, put his ear close to the block, and got ready to prove every last one of them wrong. The first thing Malcolm did was find the flashlight his father had left him, the heavy old aluminum one, with the dent in the side because the shop lights threw shadows in the wrong places, and he wanted to see the engine bay, the way you see a person's face when you're trying to tell if they're lying to you up close and honest. He leaned in over this block, and he ran his hand along the top of it slow, the way you'd run your hand along the flank of an animal to feel whether it was breathing right. It was cold, stone cold. That already told him something. A ruined engine, the kind 20 men had described in that binder, would have left signs. Scorching, warping, the smell of something that had cooked itself to death. This engine smelled like nothing at all. It smelled clean. They never even opened you up, did they? Malcolm murmured. They just read what the computer said about you, and they wrote it down and they went to lunch. He worked his way down the bay, tracing every line, every connector, every harness with his fingers, and with his eyes, and more than anything, with that thing his father had spent 30 years pouring into him that no school in the world could teach the patience to look at what everyone else had already looked at, and to refuse to see what everyone else had already seen. Around 1 in the morning, Ava stirred on the cot. "Daddy? Go back to sleep, baby. Did you fix it yet? Working on it. Close your eyes." "Is it a big problem or a little problem?" Malcolm smiled into the engine bay. "That's the question, isn't it?" he said. "That is the exact question." He straightened up and looked over at her, at the small shape of her under the blanket, her rabbit tucked under her chin. "You want to know a secret about problems, Ava?" Most of the time, the bigger everybody says a problem is, the smaller it really is. It's the little bitty ones nobody's watching that'll wreck you. The big loud ones. Those are usually just a little problem making a lot of noise. He turned back to the car. "Now sleep. I mean it this time." She sighed, the deep, dramatic sigh of a child being asked to do something impossible, and rolled over, and within a few minutes, she was gone again. Malcolm found it at 2:17 in the morning. He'd been following a harness down behind the intake, a fat bundle of wires wrapped in that black loom tape they used at the factory, and his fingers had caught on something that didn't feel right. A connector. One of a dozen along that run. But when he pressed on it, he felt the faintest give, the tiniest sponginess, where there should have been a clean, solid click. He pulled his light in close. It was a small module, no bigger than a matchbox. One of the sensors that fed information into the car's brain, a little component whose only job in the world was to report the truth about a single reading and pass it up the line. And where its housing met the connector, there was a hairline of green. Corrosion. The kind you get when moisture works its way in through a seal that failed somewhere it shouldn't have. Malcolm stared at it for a long, long time. "You," he said softly. "It's you." He didn't celebrate. He'd been doing this too long to celebrate at the first thing that looked like an answer. Plenty of men had lost plenty of jobs by falling in love with the first broken thing they found. So he made himself say the hard question out loud, the way his father taught him. "All right, prove it to yourself, Malcolm. How does one little sensor tell a whole car it's dying?" And then he answered himself, standing there alone at 2 in the morning, working it out the way he'd worked out 10,000 problems before, one honest step at a time, because the car's brain didn't know that sensor was lying. That was the whole thing. A car's computer isn't smart the way people think it's smart. It's trusting. It takes whatever its sensors tell it, and it believes them completely the way a man believes a friend. He's got no reason to doubt. And when this one little corroded module started feeding it garbage, impossible numbers, readings that couldn't be real. The computer didn't think my sensor is broken. It thought everything is broken. It looked at one number that said the world was ending. And instead of doubting the number, it doubted the whole world. It threw every warning it had. It shut down every system it could. It sat there screaming that the engine was dead, the fuel was gone, the transmission was finished, when the truth was that one $200 part had corroded, and the machine had believed a liar. Malcolm sat back down on his father's stool and let out a breath that felt like it had been building in his chest for 6 months, even though he'd only known about this car for a day and a half. "That's it," he whispered. "That's the whole thing. 20 men. Half a year. A ruined engine that was never ruined. And it's a sensor a kid could replace in an afternoon." He almost laughed. He almost cried. He wasn't sure for a second which one was coming. Because it wasn't funny, not really. Or it was, but it was the kind of funny that had a knife in it. 20 of the finest engineers in the world had stood over this car and never once considered that the smallest, cheapest, most overlooked part in the whole machine was the one telling the lie. They'd been so busy looking for a problem worthy of a $300,000 car that they'd walked right past a problem worthy of a 20-year-old sedan. They couldn't imagine that something so small could bring down something so grand, and Malcolm knew exactly why they couldn't imagine it. Because it was the same reason they couldn't imagine that a man like him could fix what they couldn't. They'd spent their whole lives believing that big things were solved by big people, and important problems had important causes, and worth was a thing you could read off a price tag, or a diploma, or the sign over a man's door. They didn't know what they were looking at. Any of it. Malcolm got up and he found a rag and he wiped the little module clean and he examined the corrosion and he thought about whether he could clean it up and reseat it or whether it was too far gone. And that was when he heard the first car pull into the lot outside. He looked at the clock. 2:40 in the morning. Headlights swept across the front windows. Then a second set. Malcolm frowned, wiped his hands and walked to the front of the shop, and through the glass he saw a black SUV, and behind it a low silver coupe, and standing in the wash of the security light buttoning his coat against the cold was Prescott. Malcolm opened the door before the man could knock. "You're up early," Malcolm said. "I couldn't sleep." Prescott didn't smile. He looked past Malcolm into the shop at the McLaren sitting there with its engine bay open and Malcolm's light hanging over it. Something flickered across his face. Malcolm couldn't tell if it was curiosity or fear. Maybe both. "I wanted to see how the great man was getting on." "You drove out here at 2:40 in the morning to check on me." "I drove out here," Prescott said, "because Victoria Sterling is the most important client my firm has, and I am not going to have her humiliated by a—" He stopped himself. "By a what?" Malcolm asked. Not angry, just curious how he'd finish it. "By false hope," Prescott said, which was not what he'd been about to say, and both of them knew it. Malcolm stepped back and held the door open. "Come look then." Prescott hesitated. He hadn't expected to be invited in. He'd expected Malcolm could see it plain on his face. He'd expected to catch Malcolm defeated. To find a tired man standing over a dead car, ready to admit he'd been a fool. And instead, he was being asked calm as Sunday to come and look at something. He came in. He walked over to the McLaren and he looked down into the engine bay, and Malcolm walked up beside him and pointed with one grease-black finger. "There," Malcolm said. "You see that connector, the little module back behind the intake?" Prescott leaned in. "The auxiliary sensor." "That what you call it?" "It's a minor input sensor. It's—" Prescott straightened up, and his voice took on that lecturing tone again, the one he used like a shield. "It's inconsequential. We checked it. Every team checked it. It reads within tolerance." "It reads within tolerance," Malcolm repeated. "When?" "When we tested it." "You test it cold or hot?" Prescott opened his mouth, closed it. "Because that little connector's got corrosion in it," Malcolm said. "Green. Right there where the seal failed. And corrosion's a funny thing, Mr. Prescott. When the car's cold and sitting still, that connection might read just fine. Metal's tight. But you run current through it, you warm it up, that corroded metal starts to move, starts to expand. And now your connection's got resistance in it. That wasn't there a minute ago. Now your sensor's not sending the truth anymore. It's sending garbage. And it only does it once things heat up, which is exactly when your fancy machines had already printed out their report and packed up their laptops. Prescott stared at the module. He didn't say anything. "You tested a cold car," Malcolm went on, gentle, almost kind. "You tested it cold, and it passed, and you crossed it off the list, and you went looking for a bigger answer. All 20 of you. Every single one crossed off the smallest part in the car because it passed a test you gave it when it wasn't under stress. And the whole time, the answer was that little green thing right there, waiting for somebody to test it when it was working hard instead of when it was resting. The silence in the garage was enormous. "That's not possible," Prescott said, but there was no conviction in it. It was the sound of a man saying something because the alternative was too big to face. "It's not just possible," Malcolm said. "It's what happened. And I can prove it to you right now if you got the stomach for it." Prescott turned and looked at him. And Malcolm watched something war across the man's face, the part of him that was a scientist, that genuinely wanted to know the truth, fighting the part of him that had spent his whole career being the smartest man in every room and could not bear the thought of being schooled at 3 a.m. by a mechanic in a worn-out shirt. "How?" Prescott said finally. It came out flat, not quite a question. More like a man surrendering a small piece of ground. "I'm going to warm it up," Malcolm said. "And I'm going to show you the reading go bad in real time. And then I'm going to clean that connector and reseat it, and I'm going to warm it up again, and I'm going to show you the reading hold steady. Same test, twice one broke thing fixed in between. That's the whole science of it. You want to watch, or you want to go back to your hotel and keep believing what's comfortable?" Prescott took off his coat. Malcolm hadn't expected that. He'd expected the man to bristle to argue to find some reason to leave. Instead, Prescott folded his coat over the workbench, rolled up his sleeves awkwardly, like a man who hadn't rolled up his sleeves for real work in a very long time, and said, "Show me." So Malcolm showed him. He hooked up his own scanner, an old one, a cheap one, nothing like the machines the 4 teams had brought, and he warmed the systems, and he had Prescott watch the live reading off that one small sensor. And for a few minutes it held. And then, as the current worked through the corroded connection, and the metal warmed and shifted, the number began to walk. Just a little at first. Then more. Then it lurched and spat out a value that couldn't possibly be real, and the second it did, the whole dash lit up red engine fuel transmission. The whole cascade, every fault the 4 teams had documented blooming across the screen in an instant. Prescott stared at it. "There's your ruined engine," Malcolm said quietly. "Right there. 20 men's worth of ruined engine, and it just showed up the second one little sensor told a lie." Prescott didn't speak for a full minute. When he did, his voice was different, smaller. "We ran it 3 times, he said. "Each team ran it 3 times to confirm." "You ran it 3 times cold," Malcolm said. "You confirmed the same wrong answer 3 times. That's not the same as being right 3 times. That's just being wrong carefully." Prescott let out a breath that was almost a laugh and almost wasn't. He put his hand on the fender of the McLaren and leaned on it and shook his head slowly. "My God," he said. "Do you know what this looks like for us 4 teams? The factory. Do you have any idea what this means for your reputation?" Malcolm said. "Yeah, I got some idea." Prescott looked at him sharply, expecting to find gloating. He didn't find any. He found a tired man looking back at him with something Prescott hadn't expected at all. Something that in a lifetime of conference rooms and laboratories he'd almost forgotten the look of. He found grace. "You could ruin us," Prescott said, slowly testing it. "You understand that. You walk out there in the morning and you show Victoria Sterling that a neighborhood garage found in one night, what 4 certified teams missed in 6 months, and you don't just fix her car. You end careers, mine included." "I know. Then why aren't you enjoying this more?" And Malcolm set down his scanner, and he wiped his hands, and he looked at Prescott for a long moment before he answered. "Because I know exactly what it feels like," Malcolm said, "to have a whole room of people decide what you are before you open your mouth. And I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy." He nodded toward the car. "You looked at me yesterday, and you saw a man who couldn't possibly know anything because of where I work, and what I wear, and what I look like. And you were wrong. Now you're standing here at 3 a.m. about to find out that being wrong feels like the floor dropping out from under you. And I could dance on that. Plenty of men would. But I got a little girl asleep 20 feet away, And I'd like her to grow up in a world where when a man's down, somebody offers him a hand instead of a boot. So no, I'm not enjoying it. I'd just as soon we both walked out of here in one piece." Prescott stared at him. "Who taught you to think like that?" he asked, and it wasn't sarcastic. For the first time since he'd walked in the door, it wasn't sarcastic at all. "My father," Malcolm said. "Same man taught me to listen to an engine. Turns out it's the same skill. You gotta get quiet, and you gotta stop assuming you already know, and you gotta be willing to hear a thing, say something you didn't expect it to say." He shrugged. "Works on cars. Works on people. Ain't much difference most days." Prescott was quiet again, then softly, "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me nothing." "I do." Prescott straightened. "What I said to you when I walked in, about embarrassing yourself, about keeping your dignity." He shook his head. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I have a doctorate. I have published papers, and I have never once in all that time done what you did tonight. I've never sat with a machine in the quiet and let it tell me what was wrong. I read the numbers. I trust the numbers. And tonight, the numbers lied to me for 6 months, and I never even suspected, because it never occurred to me that the smallest part in the car could be the one that mattered." He looked at Malcolm. "That's not a mechanical failure. That's a failure of imagination. And you don't get a doctorate in imagination." "No." Malcolm agreed. "You don't. You get it from being told your whole life that you're small and finding out that small things are exactly the ones nobody bothers to check." Something passed between the two men then in the quiet of that garage at 3 in the morning that neither of them would have believed possible 12 hours earlier. Not friendship exactly. It was too new and too strange for that. But an understanding. The kind of understanding that only happens when a man who thought he was above another man finds out all at once that he was standing on nothing. "Are you going to clean it now?" Prescott asked. "The connector." "I am." "You want to help?" Prescott hesitated. Then, almost shyly, he said, "I don't actually know how." And Malcolm Carter, the man Prescott had laughed at 18 hours before, smiled and said, "Come here, I'll teach you. It ain't hard. Ain't anything hard once somebody's willing to show you instead of assuming you can't learn." So for the next hour in the dead middle of the night, a mechanic taught an engineer how to do the thing the engineer had spent his whole life pretending to already know. Malcolm showed him how to release the connector without cracking the housing, how to clean the corrosion off the pins with the right solution and a fine brush, how to inspect the seal and find where it had failed and understand why the moisture had gotten in. Prescott's hands were clumsy. At first, a man's hands can't do at 45 what they never learned at 15. But Malcolm was patient with him, patient the way he was patient with Ava when she was learning her division, never once making the man feel stupid for not knowing. And somewhere in that hour, Prescott stopped being an enemy. "Can I ask you something?" Prescott said, watching Malcolm reseat the cleaned connector. "Go ahead." "Why do you stay here? A man with your gift. You could work anywhere. You could name your price at any dealership, any race team, any manufacturer in the world. They'd fight over you. And forgive me, you're running a 2-bay garage on the south side of the city, cutting the crusts off your daughter's sandwiches." Malcolm's hands paused for just a second. Then they kept working. "How you know about the crusts?" "You've got a drawing taped up over there. A little girl's drawing of a sandwich with no crust and a heart around it. It wasn't hard to guess." Malcolm glanced over at it and smiled. Ava had made him that when she was 5. It had hung there ever since. "My father built this place with his own 2 hands, Malcolm said. 1978. Bought this lot when nobody wanted it, put up these walls, ran electric to it himself. And this whole neighborhood, everybody in it. This is where they bring their cars. The lady down the street with the van full of kids. The old man who drives the same Buick he's had 30 years and won't let anybody but me touch it. The young fella just starting out who can't afford the dealership. This is their shop. If I close up and go make a rich man's salary tuning race cars, where do they go? They'd find someone. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they find someone who charges them double because they don't know any better. Maybe they find someone who tells them they need a whole new engine when all they need is a sensor cleaned. Malcolm looked at Prescott. You want to know the truth? I could make more money somewhere else, but I couldn't make more of myself somewhere else. The value of what I do doesn't go up because a rich person's the one paying for it. It's worth the same whether it's Victoria Sterling's McLaren or Miss Ruthie's Buick. And the day I start believing different, the day I start thinking my work only matters when important people are watching, that's the day I've lost the whole thing my daddy gave me. Prescott was quiet for a long moment. You know, he said finally, I've spent 20 years around the wealthiest, most credentialed people on earth, and I don't think I've ever heard anyone say anything as intelligent as what you just said. Not once. That's because intelligence and credentials ain't the same thing, Malcolm said, tightening the connector home with a soft final click. The world keeps mixing 'em up, and it costs people like me our whole lives. He straightened up, wiped his hands, and looked at his work. All right, he said. It's seated. Corrosion's cleaned off. I'm gonna warm it up again, and we're gonna watch that reading, and if I'm right, it's gonna hold rock steady, and this car's gonna be ready to run come morning. You ready? Prescott, to his own evident surprise, found that his heart was actually beating faster. I'm ready. Malcolm hooked the scanner back up. He warmed the systems. And the two men, the mechanic and the engineer, the one who'd been laughed at and the one who'd done the laughing, leaned in over that engine bay together and watched the single small number that had brought a $300,000 machine to its knees. It held. It warmed, and it worked, and the current ran through the cleaned connection, and the number sat there steady as a heartbeat exactly where it was supposed to be. No lurch, no garbage value, no cascade of red across the dash. Just a healthy engine warming up, reporting the plain, honest truth about itself for the first time in 6 months. Prescott let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for a full minute. It's holding, he said. My God, it's holding. Told you, Malcolm said quietly. You did. Prescott straightened up and ran a hand over his face, and when he took it away his eyes were bright, in a way he'd have been mortified for anyone to see. You told me, and I laughed at you, and you were right, and I was wrong, and it wasn't even close. He looked at Malcolm. This car is going to start tomorrow morning, isn't it? In front of Victoria, in front of the other teams. Long as nobody touches it before then, yeah, she's gonna start. Prescott nodded slowly, and then something in his face changed, and Malcolm watched a decision get made behind the man's eyes. I'm going to tell her, Prescott said. Tell her what? The truth, that you found it, that it was the sensor, that we tested it cold and crossed it off and spent 6 months looking for a catastrophe that never existed. He picked his coat up off the workbench. I could let you spring it on her tomorrow. I could stand there in the crowd and let it look like a magic trick. But you don't deserve to have it look like a trick. You deserve to have it understood. And the only way she'll understand what you actually did is if someone who was on the failed side of it explains exactly how badly we missed it and exactly how completely you didn't. Malcolm looked at him. You do that stand up in front of everybody and say you got it wrong. An hour ago I wouldn't have, Prescott admitted. An hour ago I'd have found a way to make it sound like a team effort. We narrowed it down. The local mechanic confirmed our suspicions. Some such rubbish. He shook his head, disgusted with himself. But I've been standing in your garage for 2 hours watching you work, and I can't do it. I can't take one more thing from a man who's had things taken from him his whole life. It'd make me exactly the kind of man I've apparently been all along without noticing. He held out his hand. Malcolm looked at it. Then he took it, grease and all, and Prescott didn't glance down at his palm first this time. He just shook it firm, like you shake the hand of a man you respect. Thank you, Prescott said, for not humiliating me when you had every right to, and for teaching me something at 3 a.m. that I should have learned 20 years ago. Thank you, Malcolm said, for taking your coat off. Prescott almost laughed. He put his coat back on, and he moved toward the door, and then he stopped and turned back. Can I ask you one more thing? You're on a roll. Go ahead. When you promised your daughter the car would run by morning. Prescott nodded toward the cot, where Ava was still fast asleep, one arm flung out from under the blanket, her rabbit fallen to the floor. "You made that promise before you'd found the problem, didn't you? I heard about it from the security team. You promised a child that you'd fix what 20 experts couldn't before you even opened the hood." He shook his head. "That's either the most reckless thing I've ever heard or the bravest. I genuinely can't tell which." Malcolm walked over and picked the rabbit up off the floor and tucked it back under Ava's arm, and she stirred and murmured something and settled again. "It's both," Malcolm said softly so as not to wake her. "That's the thing nobody tells you. Brave and reckless are the same thing right up until it works. Only after it works does everybody call it brave." He looked down at his daughter's face. "I promised her because if I'd said, 'I don't know, baby, we'll see,' she'd have learned something tonight I never want her to learn. She'd have learned that when the whole world says her daddy can't, her daddy starts to believe it too. And I would rather promise her something impossible and break my back making it true than teach her that people like us are supposed to quit before we start." Prescott looked at him for a long moment. "She's very lucky," he said quietly, "to have you." "No," Malcolm said, and he looked up, and for the first time all night there was something fierce in his tired eyes. "I'm the lucky one. She's the reason I never quit anything. Every hard night. Every rich man who looked through me like I was glass. Every time somebody made me feel like I didn't belong in a room. I go home and there's this little person who thinks I hung the moon, and I think I can't quit. I can't let the world win because if it wins against me, it wins against her next." He looked back down at Ava. "You spend your life around important people, Mr. Prescott. Let me tell you something about importance. Nothing I ever did in my whole life is as important as making sure that little girl grows up knowing her daddy didn't fold. Not for anybody. Not for any amount of money. Not ever." Prescott didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. He let himself out, and the door swung shut behind him, and the silver coupe and the black SUV pulled out of the lot, and Malcolm was alone again with the car and his sleeping daughter. He stood there in this quiet for a while, just looking at the McLaren, at the closed engine bay, at the machine that everyone had given up on, and he had not. And a strange feeling moved through him. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and deeper than that. The feeling a man gets when he has done in the dark with no one watching, and no one to impress the thing he was put on this earth to do. He thought about his father. He wished the way he wished every single day that the old man could have seen this. Could have walked into the shop and seen his son leaning over a $300,000 machine that 20 of the finest engineers in the world had failed to crack. He could almost hear him. "They didn't know what they were looking at, son. That's all. They never do." "No, they didn't, Daddy," Malcolm said quietly to the empty garage. "But I did." He didn't sleep. There was no point. Morning was only a few hours off, and his mind was too full to rest anyway. So instead, he did what he always did when he couldn't sleep and Ava could. He cleaned. He wiped down his tools and hung them back on the pegboard in the order his father had taught him. He swept the floor. He organized the parts bin. And he made himself a cup of coffee from the little machine in the office, and he sat down on his father's stool in front of the McLaren, and he waited for the sun. Around 5, Ava woke up. She sat up on the cot hair sticking up every which way, and she looked around, and she found her daddy sitting there in front of the fancy car with a cup of coffee, and she rubbed her eyes. "Daddy, did you sleep?" "Little bit." He lied. "You didn't." She said it with the total certainty of a child who knows her parents' face better than her own. She climbed off the cot and padded over to him and leaned against his side, and he put his arm around her. "You fix it," she asked. Malcolm looked at the car, then he looked down at his daughter. "I fixed it, baby." Her whole face lit up. "You did. You really did, even though all the smart men said you couldn't. Even though. How?" And Malcolm thought about how to answer that. He thought about the corrosion and the resistance and the false readings and the cascade of faults. He thought about the cold tests and the warm failures. He thought about 6 months and 20 men in a fat binder. And then he thought about how to say all of it to a 7-year-old, and he found that when you had to say a true thing to a child, it came out simpler and cleaner than any other way you could ever say it. You remember what I told you last night, he said, about how the big loud problems are usually just little problems making a lot of noise. Ava nodded. Well, this whole car was screaming that it was dying. Everything was wrong. The engine, the gas, everything. All the smart men heard all that screaming, and they believed it. They thought this car's got 100 big problems, we can never fix all that. He held up his thumb and finger an inch apart. But it was one little thing. This big. One little part whose only job was to tell the truth, and it got a little bit broke, and it started telling a lie. And the whole car believed the lie. And all the smart men believed the lie too. And they gave up. He looked at her. But I got quiet and I listened, and I found the little liar, and I cleaned it up, and now the car's gonna tell the truth again. That's the whole thing, baby. That's all I did. I just didn't believe the screaming. Ava took this in with the seriousness she gave to all important things. So it was a little problem, she said. Like you said, not a big one. Smallest one in the whole car. And you found it 'cause you didn't believe everybody. That's right. Ava was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Malcolm would remember for the rest of his life, something that a 7-year-old had no business understanding, but understood anyway. The way children sometimes see, straight through to the center of a thing, that grown people spend their whole lives dancing around. Daddy, she said, is that why people don't believe in you? 'Cause they think you're a little problem, but really you're the answer. Malcolm didn't say anything for a second. He couldn't. Something had closed up his throat. Then he pulled his daughter into his lap, and he held her, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head, and when he could finally speak, his voice came out rough. Come here, he said. Where'd you learn to say something like that? I don't know, Ava said, muffled against his shirt. I just thought it. You just thought it. He laughed, and it came out shaky. Lord, you just thought it. He held her back and looked at her face, that small, serious face that was the whole reason he got up every morning. Baby, listen to me. Because you're right. You're righter than you know. Yeah, that's exactly it. The whole world's been looking at me my whole life like I'm the little problem, like I'm the thing that don't matter, the man in the old shirt, in the old shop in the part of town they drive past. He tucked a piece of her hair behind her ear. But you know what? Sometimes the thing everybody's overlooking is the exact thing they needed the whole time. Sometimes the smallest part in the whole machine is the one that's telling the only truth that matters. And they'll walk right past it over and over looking for something bigger. Because they can't imagine that something they think is small could be the answer. But it is, Ava said. But it is, Malcolm agreed. Sometimes it is. He set her down and stood up and stretched his back, and outside the windows, the sky was beginning to go gray, then pink. The first light of the morning that was going to change both their lives, though neither of them fully knew it yet. Now, Malcolm said, that fancy lady and all her smart men are going to be here at 9 o'clock, expecting to hear that your daddy failed just like everybody else. And instead, they're going to see this car start right up. He looked down at Ava, and there was something new in his face. Something that had been buried under 3 years of grief and 41 years of being told no, a kind of quiet, unbreakable steel. And you're going to be right here to see it. Because I want you to remember this day for the rest of your life. I want you to remember what it looks like when everybody says your daddy can't. And your daddy does anyway. Ava grinned up at him, gap-toothed, fearless, sure of him the way only a child can be sure of a parent. I already know you can, Daddy, she said. I never didn't know it. And Malcolm Carter, who had not cried in front of his daughter one single time in the 3 years since her mother died, who had held it all in, carried it all himself, set it down on no one's counter, turned away toward the workbench and wiped his eyes with the back of a grease-stained hand and let himself, just for one moment, in the gray light of that morning, believe that maybe the world was finally about to see what his little girl had never once doubted. They came at 9 on the dot. Malcolm heard the vehicles before he saw them. The low growl of the SUVs, the crunch of expensive tires on his cracked lot, and he set down his coffee and stood up from his father's stool and told Ava, Stay by the office, baby. Watch from there. This next part's going to get crowded. But it wasn't just the two SUVs this time. There were 4 vehicles, then 6, then more. Word had gotten out somehow, in the night later, Malcolm would learn that one of the engineers from the Munich team had let it slip, and that a reporter who covered the automotive world had caught wind that Victoria Sterling's impossible McLaren was sitting in a 2-bay garage on the south side, and now they came. Reporters. A photographer with 3 cameras hanging off him. 2 men Malcolm didn't recognize in the sharp suits of people who work for very rich people. And the engineers. All of them. The whole cast of the 6-month failure come to watch the local man fail the same way they had, because misery loves company, and there is nothing that makes a proud man feel better than watching someone else fall into the same hole he fell into. Victoria Sterling came in last, the way important people always come in last, and she stopped just inside the door and looked around at the crowd filling up Malcolm's small garage, and Malcolm could see she hadn't ordered this. She looked, if anything, annoyed by it. This was supposed to be private, a quiet gamble, and instead it had become a show. "Mr. Carter," she said, crossing to him. She was in a different coat today, deep blue, and she looked like she hadn't slept much either. "I apologize for all of this. I didn't invite half these people. It appears the story got out." "It's all right," Malcolm said. "It's not, but thank you for saying so." She lowered her voice. "I'll be honest with you, because you've been honest with me. I came here this morning expecting to pay you for your trouble and take my car to a museum. I didn't tell my board I was coming. I didn't tell anyone I trusted, because I knew what they'd say. They'd say I'd lost my mind chasing an answer in a place like—" She stopped. "In a place like this," Malcolm finished for her without heat. Victoria had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes." "Well," Malcolm said, "let's see what a place like this can do." And that was when Prescott stepped forward. Malcolm hadn't known if the man would actually do it. It was one thing to promise something at 3 in the morning, in the quiet, when it was just the 2 of you, and the truth was fresh, and the shame was raw. It was another thing entirely to do it in front of reporters and cameras and every colleague whose respect you'd spent 20 years earning. Malcolm had figured honestly that when the sun came up and the crowd showed, Prescott would find his nerve had gone somewhere in the night. But Prescott stepped forward, and he cleared his throat, and he said loud enough for the room to hear, "Ms. Sterling, before Mr. Carter does anything, there's something I need to say. And I'd ask that the press hear it too, because if I only say it quietly, it won't mean anything." The room went still. Victoria turned to him surprised. "Dr. Prescott." Prescott's face was pale, but his voice was steady. "I came here last night, at 2 in the morning, uninvited. I came because I was certain Mr. Carter was going to fail, and I wanted to see it, and I wanted to be able to tell you I'd seen it so that you'd feel better about the money you'd spent on my firm." He swallowed. "That is the truth, and it's not a flattering one, and I'm saying it anyway." Nobody moved. The photographer very quietly raised his camera. "What I found when I got here," Prescott continued, "was not a man failing. What I found was a man who had already located the problem. A problem that my team and 3 other certified teams and the factory itself had all missed. For 6 months. His voice caught just slightly and he pushed through it. "It's a sensor. A single auxiliary sensor back behind the intake. It corroded. And corroded it red fine when the car was cold, which is how we tested it, every one of us 3 times each, and it fed false data through the entire system the moment the car warmed up. Which is to say, we tested it under the one condition where it worked, confirmed our mistake 3 times, and crossed off the actual answer. All of us. Every team." A reporter near the front said, "You're telling us the engine was never damaged." "I'm telling you." Prescott said, "that the engine is perfect. It was always perfect. We spent 6 months and a fortune diagnosing a catastrophic failure that did not exist because none of us, not one of us, myself included, thought to consider that the smallest, cheapest component in a $300,000 machine could be the thing bringing it down." He turned and looked at Malcolm. This man considered it, in one night, because he did the one thing none of us did. He didn't trust the report. He listened to the car. The garage erupted in noise. Reporters shouting questions. The two engineers from the Munich team talking over each other, one of them red in the face, insisting it wasn't possible. They'd been thorough, they'd been meticulous. The photographer's shutter going like a machine gun. And Victoria Sterling stood in the middle of it all, staring at Prescott. And then turning slowly to stare at Malcolm. And on her face was an expression Malcolm had never once seen directed at him by a person like her in his entire life. It wasn't surprise. It was past surprise. It was reckoning. "Is this true?" she asked Malcolm quietly under the noise. "What he's saying, is it true?" "Come here," Malcolm said. "I'll show you. I'll show all of you. Y'all want to argue about whether it's possible, or you want to watch it happen." That shut the room up. Malcolm walked to the McLaren. Ava from the office doorway watched with her hands pressed together under her chin. Prescott stepped back to give Malcolm room, and as he did, he caught the eye of one of the Munich engineers, the red-faced one, and said low, "Don't. Whatever you're about to say to defend yourself, don't. I said the same things in my own head at 3 this morning. They're not true. Just watch." Malcolm opened the driver's door. The crowd pressed in. Phones came up. The reporters went quiet. Even the two rich men in the sharp suits leaned forward. Malcolm stood there a moment with his hand on the door, and then he turned around and looked at all of them. And something came over him. Not showmanship. He wasn't that kind of man, but a kind of gravity, a sense of the size of the moment. And he decided that if the whole world was going to be standing in his garage, then the whole world was going to hear the thing that mattered. "Before I start this car," Malcolm said, and his voice carried, and the room stilled to hear it, "I want to say one thing, and I'm not saying it to embarrass anybody. Dr. Prescott already stood up and told the truth, and that took more guts than fixing any car, and I respect him for it." Prescott looked down at his shoes. "But I want to say it because there's a lesson in here bigger than a McLaren, and I got a little girl standing right there." He nodded toward Ava, and every head in the room turned to look at the child in the doorway, and she went shy and half hid behind the frame. "And I want her to hear me say it out loud." He turned back to the crowd. 20 of the smartest, most educated, best-paid people in this whole industry looked at this car, and they all decided the same thing, and they were all wrong. Not because they're stupid. They're not stupid. They're brilliant. But they were looking for a big important problem because it was a big important car owned by a big important person. He paused. And it never crossed a single one of their minds that the answer might be the smallest, cheapest, most overlooked thing in the whole machine. They walked right past it, over and over, for 6 months, because they couldn't imagine that something they thought was that small could possibly be that important. The garage was dead silent now. "I found it," Malcolm said, "because I've spent my whole life being the small thing everybody walks past. The man in the old shirt, the shop on the wrong side of town. I know what it is to be looked at and counted out before you open your mouth. So when I got in this car and everything was screaming that it was dying, I didn't look for something big. I looked for the little thing nobody bothered to check. Because I know from my own life that's usually where the truth's been hiding the whole time." He let that sit for a second. Then he almost smiled. "Now, let's start her up." He got in. He settled behind the wheel. And Malcolm Carter, 41 years old. A single father. A man raising his daughter alone in a shop. His father built with his hands reached out, one grease-stained finger toward the start button of the impossible car while a billionaire CEO and 20 experts and a room full of reporters held their breath. He pressed it. For 1 full second, nothing happened. Malcolm heard behind him, the red-faced Munich engineer let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "See, I told you." And he heard Victoria's sharp intake of air, and he heard, worst of all, the tiny sound of Ava in the doorway whispering, "Come on, Daddy," under her breath. And then, the McLaren woke up. It didn't cough. It didn't struggle. It didn't throw a single warning. The engine turned over clean and smooth and caught on the first try, and settled instantly into a low, even powerful idle. The sound of a healthy machine that had been perfectly healthy the entire time, that had only ever needed one small liar cleaned out of its guts so it could tell the truth again. The garage exploded. The reporters were shouting. The photographer had abandoned any pretense of composure and was firing frame after frame. One of the engineers actually sat down on an overturned bucket and put his face in his hands. The two men in sharp suits were talking rapidly into their phones. And over all of it, cutting through all of it, came a sound that Malcolm heard above everything else, because it was the only sound in the world that had ever mattered to him. Ava in the doorway screaming with joy. "You did it! Daddy, you did it!" She broke from the office and ran across the garage, dodging between the legs of reporters, and Malcolm barely had time to get the door open and get out before she launched herself at him. And he caught her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and her legs around his waist. And she was laughing and crying at the same time, and he held her, and the impossible car rumbled behind them, and for one moment, Malcolm Carter did not care about a single other person in that room. "I told you," Ava was saying into his neck. "I told you you could. I told you." "You did, baby," Malcolm said, his own eyes wet. "You told me. You never once didn't believe it, did you?" "Never once," she said fiercely, pulling back to look at him. "Not one time." And in the middle of all the noise, all the shouting reporters, and the sitting down engineers, and the flashing cameras, Malcolm Carter stood holding his daughter, and looked at her face, and understood that this, not the car, not the vindication, not any of it, this was the thing he'd stayed up all night for. This was the thing he'd made an impossible promise for. This little girl believing in him with her whole heart, and getting to watch that belief turn out to be true. Then slowly the noise around them began to change. Malcolm became aware that Victoria Sterling was walking toward him, and that the crowd was going quiet around her the way crowds do when a powerful person moves, everyone stepping back to make a path, everyone waiting to see what she'd do. Because in a room full of people who had just watched the impossible happen, there was still only one person whose reaction actually counted, and it was the woman whose car it was. Malcolm set Ava down but kept a hand on her shoulder. He turned to face Victoria. She stopped a few feet away, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. She just looked at him. Really looked the way she hadn't looked at him yesterday when she'd decided in 2 seconds what he was worth. She looked at the grease on his hands, and the worn shirt, and the tired eyes, and Malcolm watched her see something she hadn't been able to see the day before, because the day before her eyes had been full of everything she'd already assumed. "Mr. Carter," she said. And then she stopped because her voice wasn't steady, and Victoria Sterling was not a woman who was comfortable with her voice not being steady in front of cameras. She tried again. 22 specialists, she said. 6 months. The best people I could find from all over the world. And you. She shook her head. She couldn't finish it. "I got lucky," Malcolm said, trying to give her a way out of the enormity of it, the way he'd tried to give Prescott a way out at 3 in the morning. "No." Victoria's voice came back hard and clear, and she said it like she was correcting a mistake she couldn't stand to let stand. "No, don't do that. Don't make it small. You didn't get lucky. I've spent 30 years around lucky people and talented people, and I know the difference, and what you did was not luck." She took a breath. "You did something none of my experts could do, and I want to understand how, not the sensor." Dr. Prescott explained the sensor. "I mean how. How did you know to look where no one else looked?" The room was silent again, everyone straining to hear, and Malcolm thought about it. He looked down at Ava, and then back at Victoria, and he decided to tell her the truth, the real truth, the one underneath the mechanical one. "You want to know the honest answer," he said. "I looked there because that's where I live." Victoria frowned. "I don't understand." "The small, overlooked place," Malcolm said. "The thing everybody walks past because they figure it's too small to matter. Ms. Sterling, that's not just where the problem was in your car. That's where I've spent my whole life. I am the thing people walk past, and you learn something living there. You learn that the world's wrong about what's small and what's big. You learn that the things everybody overlooks are usually holding up more than anybody realizes." He shrugged. "Your engineers couldn't imagine the answer was something that small. I could." Because I know what it is to be that small in somebody's eyes. And I know we're not near as small as people think." Victoria stared at him. And then something happened that no one in that garage expected, least of all Victoria Sterling herself. Her eyes filled up. She turned her face away quickly, and she pressed the back of one manicured hand against her mouth, and for a moment, the most powerful woman in the industry stood in a two-bay garage on the south side of the city and fought to keep from breaking down in front of a room full of cameras. And she lost the fight a little. A tear got loose and ran down her cheek before she could stop it. Malcolm, who understood people the way he understood engines, by getting quiet and listening and not assuming he already knew, recognized that this was not about the car anymore. Something he'd said had hit something in her that had nothing to do with a McLaren. "Ms. Sterling," he said gently. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said in a voice that was not fine at all. She wiped the tear away with a sharp, embarrassed motion. "I'm sorry. This is unprofessional. I don't usually—" She stopped and took a breath and got hold of herself, and when she spoke again, her voice was steadier, but there was something raw underneath it. "You reminded me of someone. That's all. Something you said." "Who?" And Victoria Sterling looked at Malcolm Carter and looked at the McLaren idling behind him and looked at the little girl standing under his hand, and for a moment it seemed like she might not answer. Then she did. Quietly. Just to him, though the whole room heard it. "I'll tell you," she said. "But not here. Not in front of all this." She glanced at the cameras, the reporters, the crowd. "There's more to this car than you know, Mr. Carter. More to why I couldn't let it go. Why I came to a place." She caught herself, softened it. "Why I came all the way out here when everyone I trusted told me to give up." She looked at him. "You've earned the truth of it, but not like this. Can we talk privately when all these people are gone?" Malcolm looked at her for a long moment. And whatever he saw in her face, the tears she hadn't meant to shed, the rawness under the polish, the thing his words had cracked open in her, it was enough. "Yeah," he said. "We can talk." Victoria nodded and gathered herself and turned to face the room, and just like that, the CEO was back. The polish restored the powerful woman in command of the space again. But Malcolm had seen underneath it now. He'd heard the engine trying to turn over under all the warnings. And he knew that whatever was really going on with Victoria Sterling, it was a great deal bigger than a broken car. "All right," Victoria said to the crowd, and her voice had recovered its authority completely. "I think we've all seen what we came to see." She looked at the reporters. "You'll have your story. Mr. Carter fixed a car that 22 specialists could not. You can print that. Print it exactly like that." Her eyes found the red-faced Munich engineer, then Prescott, then swept the rest of them. "And you can print that the difference between them and him was not equipment and not education and not money. It was that he was willing to consider an answer they thought was beneath them. Print that too." The reporters scribbled, the cameras flashed, and then Victoria did one more thing, and it was the thing that told Malcolm more about the woman she might become than anything else that morning. She walked over to Ava. The little girl looked up at her, half hiding behind Malcolm's leg. Uncertain this was the famous lady, the one with the whole page, and now she was crouching down to Ava's level in her expensive coat, right there on the dirty garage floor. "Hi," Victoria said. "You're Ava." Ava nodded wide-eyed. "I watched you run across this whole garage to hug your dad," Victoria said. "You were so sure he did it. You never doubted him for a second. Did you?" Ava shook her head. "Never once," she said. "Not one time." Victoria smiled, and it was a real smile, and something behind it was breaking a little. "Do you know how lucky you are to have a dad like that?" "He says he's the lucky one," Ava said. "'Cause of me." And that did it. Victoria's composure cracked again just for a second, and she reached out and very gently touched the little girl's cheek, and she said so quietly that only Malcolm and Ava could hear it, "You're both lucky. Don't let anybody ever tell you different, not anybody. No matter how much money they have or how important they think they are." She stood up and looked at Malcolm, and there was something almost like grief in her eyes. I would have given anything, she said, for my own family to have understood that, when it still mattered. And with that she turned and began issuing quiet instructions to her assistants about clearing the garage and getting the press out, and Malcolm stood there holding his daughter's hand, watching the powerful woman put herself back together piece by piece, and knowing the way he always knew when he got quiet and listened, that the real story of the McLaren, the reason it had sat impossible for 6 months and drawn a billionaire to the south side of the city, was a story he hadn't heard yet, but he would. She'd said so, when the crowd was gone, and as the reporters filed out and the engineers gathered their equipment in stunned silence, and Prescott lingered by the door and gave Malcolm a small respectful nod before he left. Malcolm looked down at Ava, who was still holding his hand and grinning up at him like he'd hung every star in the sky. "Daddy," she said, "is the fancy lady sad?" Malcolm watched Victoria across the garage, giving her instructions straight-backed and powerful, and underneath it all, carrying something heavy he couldn't see the shape of yet. "Yeah, baby," he said quietly. "I think she is. I think she's been sad a long time, and I don't think anybody's noticed on account of how important she looks." Ava considered this. "Maybe she's a big loud problem," she said. "That's really a little sad one underneath." Malcolm looked down at his daughter, this child who kept seeing straight to the center of things, and he squeezed her hand, and he said, "You know what maybe she is? Maybe that's exactly what she is." And the McLaren idled on behind them, alive and running and perfect. Its long, impossible ordeal finally over, while in the quiet corner of that garage, the woman who owned it waited to tell a grease-stained mechanic the one thing she had never been able to say to anyone else in the world. It took the better part of an hour for the garage to empty out. The reporters left first, still buzzing already, writing the story in their heads. Then the engineers packing their equipment in a silence that was its own kind of confession, the red-faced Munich man last of all. And he stopped at the door and looked back at Malcolm and opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, and then couldn't find it and just left. The assistants in the sharp suits organized the flatbed and the security detail, and then at a quiet word from Victoria, made themselves scarce waiting out in the vehicles. And then it was just the three of them. Malcolm and Victoria and Ava and the McLaren, which Malcolm had switched off, so that the garage was quiet again, the way it had been in the night. "Baby," Malcolm said, crouching down to Ava, "I need you to go do your homework in the office for a little while. Me and Ms. Sterling gotta talk about some grown folks things." Ava looked from her father to Victoria and back. She had a child's instinct for when something important was happening, and she didn't want to miss it. But she also had a child's training, and when her daddy used that particular gentle but firm voice, she knew it wasn't a negotiation. "Okay," she said, "but can I have the fancy lady's autograph after for show and tell?" Victoria let out a surprised laugh, the first real laugh Malcolm had heard from her. "You absolutely can," she said. "I'll sign whatever you want." Ava grinned and trotted off to the office, and Malcolm watched her go. And then he pulled his father's stool over and turned it around and gestured for Victoria to sit, and he leaned back against the workbench across from her, arms folded, waiting. He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that the fastest way to get the truth out of a person was the same as the fastest way to get it out of a machine. You got quiet, and you waited, and you let it come. Victoria sat down on the old wooden stool in her expensive coat, and for a while she didn't say anything. She looked at the McLaren. She ran her eyes over it, the long blue lines of it, and Malcolm watched her face do something complicated. "You want to know why I couldn't let it go," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "When you're ready. Everyone told me to, my board, my friends, my own head half the time." She let out a slow breath. A rational person, when 22 of the best specialists in the world tell her a car can't be fixed, accepts it, writes it off, buys another car. God knows I could afford another car. She looked at her hands. But I couldn't, and they all thought I'd lost my mind chasing this one broken machine to the ends of the earth, bringing it to a... She stopped and looked at him. "To a place like this," Malcolm said, easy. "You can say it. I'm not going to break." "To a place like this," she agreed quietly. Yes. When my assistant found your name, I almost didn't call. I want to be honest with you because you've been nothing but honest with me. I looked at the address, and I looked at the neighborhood, and I looked at the picture of your garage online, and I very nearly told her to keep looking. She met his eyes. I'm ashamed of that now. But I want you to know it because if I'm going to tell you the rest, I have to tell you all of it. Go ahead then. Victoria was quiet another moment, and then she said, The car belonged to my brother. Malcolm didn't say anything. He just kept his eyes on her steady and let her go on. His name was Daniel, she said. He was 2 years younger than me, and he was... Her voice wavered and she pressed her lips together and got it back. He was the opposite of me in every way that mattered. I was the ambitious one, the one who wanted to run things. Our father built Sterling Automotive from nothing, and from the time I was a girl, I wanted to take it over, wanted it so badly I could taste it. And I did. I clawed my way up, I did everything right, I became exactly what my father wanted me to be. She looked at the McLaren. And Daniel didn't want any of it. What did he want? This. She gestured at the car at the garage, at all of it. This. He wanted to work with his hands. He didn't care about running the company. He didn't care about the money or the title or the corner office. He wanted to build engines. He wanted to understand how things worked, take them apart, put them back together. Her eyes were shining now. When he was 16, he rebuilt an entire motorcycle in our garage. Our father found out and was furious. Grease all over the floor of a home that cost $8 million. And Daniel just looked up at him, covered head to toe in oil, happier than I'd ever seen him, and he said, Dad, I finally found the thing I'm good at. Malcolm felt something tighten in his chest. He thought of Ava in the office doing her homework in a shop his own father had built. He thought of his father's hands. He said nothing. And do you know what our father did? Victoria's voice had gone hard the way a voice goes hard when it's covering a wound. He told him it was a waste. He told him no son of his was going to be a grease monkey. She flinched at her own use of the word. That was the phrase. Grease monkey. My father said it like it was the lowest thing a person could be. He said Daniel had been given every advantage in the world, the best schools, every opportunity, a family name that opened every door, and he was going to throw it all away to do work that... She stopped. That people like me do, Malcolm said quietly. Victoria looked at him, and her face crumpled just for a second before she pulled it back together. Yes, she whispered. That people like you do. And I, God forgive me, I agreed with him. I sided with our father. I sat there at that dinner table, and I told my brother he was being childish. I told him to grow up. I told him that talent meant nothing without ambition, without status, without making something of yourself that the world could see and respect. I told my own brother that the thing he loved most in the world wasn't good enough. A tear ran down her face, and she didn't bother to wipe it this time. I said everything my father said because I wanted to be like my father, and being like my father meant looking down on exactly the kind of man my brother wanted to be. The garage was very quiet. What happened to him? Malcolm asked gently. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. He left, she said. He couldn't stand it anymore. The pressure, the disappointment being made to feel like his whole self was a failure. He left the family, and he went off. And he built a life doing exactly what he loved, and he barely spoke to any of us for years. And I was so wrapped up in the company and becoming CEO, in proving I was worthy of everything Daniel had walked away from that I let him go. I told myself he'd come around. I told myself there'd be time to fix it later. I told myself all the things people tell themselves when they're too proud and too busy to do the thing they know they should do. Her voice broke. And then there wasn't time. There was an accident 3 years ago, and there wasn't any more later. Malcolm closed his eyes for a second. He knew that grief. He knew it in his bones. The particular horror of later running out. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it all the way down. The last real conversation I had with my brother, Victoria said, was a fight about his life not being good enough. That's the last thing I ever really said to him. that what he loved wasn't good enough. She wiped her face now roughly. This was his car, the McLaren. He bought it himself with money he made with his own hands doing the work my father called a waste, and he loved it. He used to say it was the most honest machine he'd ever touched, and when he died it came to me along with everything else of his, and it sat in my garage, and I couldn't drive it, and I couldn't sell it, and I couldn't do anything with it. It was the last piece of him I had. And then it broke, Malcolm said, understanding now. And then it broke. Victoria let out a laugh that had no humor in it at all. The last thing I had of him, the thing he loved. And it just stopped. And every warning light in the world came on. And I panicked. I panicked in a way I have never panicked over anything in my life, over any business deal, any crisis, any of it. Because it felt like... Her voice cracked wide open now, and she let it. It felt like losing him a second time. Like the last living piece of my brother was dying, and there was nothing I could do. And it was my fault. It was all my fault, because I never once told him. She couldn't finish. She put her face and her hands right there on Malcolm's father's stool, the most powerful woman in the industry, and she wept. And Malcolm Carter, who did not know this woman, who 24 hours ago had been an object of her casual dismissal, did the thing his father had taught him to do. The thing that was the same for engines and for people. He didn't try to fix it with words. He didn't tell her it wasn't her fault, because that would have been a lie, and she'd have known it. He just crossed the garage, and he pulled up a milk crate, and he sat down next to her close, and he put a steady hand on her shoulder, and he let her cry. After a while, she got quiet. She lifted her head, and her makeup was ruined, and she looked 10 years older, and also somehow younger the way people do when the mask finally comes off. "So that's why I couldn't let it go," she said hoarse. "That's why I chased 22 specialists and spent a fortune, and came all the way out here when everyone said I was mad. It was never about the car. It was about him. About getting one more chance to not fail the thing he loved." She looked at Malcolm. "And you fixed it. In one night. A man doing exactly the work my brother wanted to do. The work my family called a waste. You fixed the thing that all my money and all my important people couldn't." She shook her head slowly. "Do you understand what that does to a person? To watch that? Tell me," Malcolm said. "It means my father was wrong," Victoria said, and her voice shook with the size of it. "It means I was wrong. It means everything I told my brother, everything I helped make him feel was a lie. The work he loved wasn't beneath anyone. It wasn't a waste. It was..." She gestured at the McLaren, at the impossible thing Malcolm had done. "It was this. It was the thing that everyone with all their degrees and all their status couldn't do. Daniel spent his whole life being told that what he was good at didn't count, and he died believing his own sister thought he was a failure. And it took a stranger in a garage on the south side doing the exact work my brother loved to show me that my brother was right all along. That we were the fools. That we were the ones who never understood what we were looking at." Malcolm was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that he had never said out loud to anyone, not even to Ava. "Can I tell you something, Miss Sterling? Victoria, please. After all this, Victoria." "Victoria," he nodded. "My daddy built this shop in 1978, and you know what my whole life was being your brother in reverse." She frowned, not understanding. "Your brother was born into everything, and all he wanted was to do this work," Malcolm said, gesturing at the garage. "I was born into this work, and all my life people looked at me the way your father looked at your brother, like I was less. Like what I do is a small thing, a lowly thing, a thing to escape from if you've got any sense." He looked at his own hands, the grease worked into them. "Every rich man who ever brought his car into my shop and talked down to me. Every person who assumed I couldn't read a diagnostic or understand a warranty. Every loan officer who looked at mechanic on a form and heard risk. My whole life the world's been telling me that what I do, what your brother wanted to do, is the bottom. Is the thing successful people don't do." His jaw tightened. "And your brother had a family that could have given him the whole world tell him the same thing. That must have been Lord, I can't even imagine that. To have that love, and have it tell you your soul is a waste. Victoria was crying again silently now. So when you tell me it took a stranger in a garage to show you your brother was right, Malcolm said, I want you to understand something. It didn't take a stranger. It took your brother's own kind. Because your brother and me were the same man, just born on different sides of a fence. He'd have understood everything about this shop. He'd have understood why I stayed. He'd have understood why I charge Miss Ruthie down the street the same as I'd charge you. Your brother knew the thing you're just now learning, that the work is holy, that it doesn't matter who's watching, that a machine doesn't care what school you went to or what your last name is, it only answers to the person willing to actually understand it. He looked at her. Your brother wasn't a failure, Victoria. Your brother was one of us. And there's no shame in that. There never was. The shame was always on the people who couldn't see it. Victoria pressed both hands over her mouth and her shoulders shook, and Malcolm just kept his hand steady on her shoulder and let her get through it. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small. He would have liked you, she said. Daniel, he would have liked you so much. He'd have wanted to spend a week in this garage just watching you work. A wet laugh. He'd have driven me crazy talking about you. I'd have liked him too, sounds like. You would have. She wiped her eyes and took a shaking breath, and Malcolm watched her begin the slow work of gathering herself back together. But it was a different kind of gathering than she'd done in front of the cameras. That had been putting the mask back on. This was something else. This was a person deciding what to do with a truth that had just rearranged her entire life. Can I ask you something? She said. Course. The repair. What do I owe you? Malcolm almost smiled. You're gonna try to overpay me. I can see it coming. I want to overpay you enormously, Victoria said, and there was the ghost of her old force in it. I want to write you a check that changes your life and this little girl's life and never think about money again. You have no idea I have spent a fortune on this car. 6 months of specialists. What I paid those 4 teams could fund this garage for a decade, and they failed. You succeeded in one night. If I paid you what you were actually worth relative to them, it would be, you'd pay me the fair price for the work, Malcolm said. That's what you'd do. Victoria stopped. I cleaned a corroded sensor and reseated a connector, Malcolm said. That's a couple $100 in parts and a night's labor. That's the job. That's what it's worth. That's insane, Victoria said. You could name any number. I'd pay it. Anyone would pay it. You have leverage over me. That do you understand what you could ask for? You fix the last piece of my dead brother that I have left on this earth. There is no number I wouldn't pay. I know, Malcolm said quietly. That's exactly why I won't take it. Victoria stared at him. Victoria, listen to me. He leaned forward on the milk crate, elbows on his knees. You just spent an hour telling me the most painful thing in your whole life. You told me your brother died thinking his work wasn't worth anything, and that it broke your heart to find out he was right and your family was wrong. Right. Yes. So think about what you're asking me to do. His voice was gentle, but it had steel in it. You're asking me to charge you a fortune because you're desperate, because you're grieving, because I've got leverage over your broken heart. You want me to look at your pain and see a payday. He shook his head slowly. That's the exact thing your father did to your brother. That's the whole disease. Looking at a person and asking, what can I get out of this? Deciding a thing's worth is about how bad somebody needs it or how much money's standing behind it instead of what the thing actually is. Victoria's mouth had fallen open slightly. My work is worth what it's worth, Malcolm said. It's worth the same whether it's your McLaren or Miss Ruthie's Buick. It doesn't get more valuable because a rich lady in pain is the one paying for it. And it doesn't get less valuable because a poor lady is. That's the whole thing your brother understood. The value of the work doesn't change depending on who's watching or how much money's in the room. He held her eyes. If I let you overpay me because you're hurting, then everything I just told you about your brother becomes a lie. Then I'm just one more person who looked at Daniel Sterling's memory and saw something to profit from. And I won't do that to him. Even though I never met him. I won't. For a long moment, Victoria Sterling could not speak. And then she did something Malcolm did not expect. She reached out and took his hand, his grease-stained, work-ruined hand, in both of her manicured ones, and she held it, and she looked at it like it was something precious. In 30 years, she said, her voice thick, of running a company worth billions of dollars, surrounded by the most brilliant, most credentialed, most successful people money can assemble. I have never met anyone who said no to money for a reason like that. Not once. Everyone I know would have taken the check. Everyone I know would have called it good business. She looked up at him, and her eyes were streaming again, but her voice was steady, now steady and certain. My brother was right about everything, wasn't he? Everything. About the work, about what matters, about what a person's actually worth. She squeezed his hand. And it only took me losing him and finding you to finally understand it. Malcolm didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. He just let her hold his hand. I'm going to pay you the fair price, she said finally. Because you've asked me to, and because I understand now why you're asking, and I'm not going to insult you by fighting you on it. She took a breath. But Malcolm, I'm not walking out of this garage and never seeing you again. Do you understand me? Whatever I do next, whatever comes of this, I am not letting a man like you disappear back into a world that walks past him. I've already made that mistake with one person I should have seen. I'm not making it twice. Victoria, I don't know what it looks like yet, she said, and Malcolm could see her mind starting to move. Now could see the CEO reawakening, but pointed at something new, something she hadn't been pointed at that morning. But I have resources. I have more resources than one person should have, honestly, and I've spent 30 years pointing them at things that made my father proud, and never once at anything that would have made my brother proud. She stood up from the stool, and she straightened her ruined coat, and even with her makeup wrecked and her eyes red, she looked suddenly like a woman who had found a purpose. There are people out there like you, aren't there? Talented people, doing this work, getting looked past, getting told they're the bottom. Whole world full of them, Malcolm said quietly. People with your gift and none of your luck. No shop of their own. No father who built them a place. Just the talent and the doors closed in their faces. Yeah. How many do you think? How many people are out there right now who could do what you did last night? Who could do things no engineer with a doctorate could do, and will never get the chance because the world decided what they were worth before they opened their mouths. Malcolm looked at her. And he thought about all the young men and women he'd met over the years. Kids in his own neighborhood with hands that understood machines. Kids nobody would hire, kids who ended up in trouble or in dead-end jobs or just ground down all that talent going nowhere, because talent without opportunity is just a slow tragedy. More than you could count, he said. More than you could ever count, Victoria. She nodded slowly, and something settled in her face. Some decision taking root. Then that's what I'm going to do with him, she said quietly. With who? Oh, with my brother. Her voice was steady now and full. For 30 years, I pointed everything I had at what my father wanted. I'm going to spend the rest of it pointing it at what my brother would have wanted. And I'm going to need your help to do it, Malcolm, because I don't know the first thing about the world you come from. But you do. And between what you understand and what I can build. She stopped and looked at the McLaren, her brother's honest machine running again after everyone had given it up for dead. Maybe we could keep some of these people from getting overlooked, the way Daniel was overlooked, the way you've been overlooked your whole life. Malcolm was quiet for a long moment. Then from the office doorway, a small voice piped up. Ava had abandoned her homework and had been listening the way children always listen to the things they're not supposed to hear. Daddy, she said, is the fancy lady gonna help other people who fix things? Malcolm looked over at his daughter, then back at Victoria, who was looking at Ava with an expression of such raw longing that it was almost hard to watch a woman looking at a child and at a father and at everything her brother might have had, and everything her family had thrown away. "Yeah, baby," Malcolm said slowly. "I think maybe she is." Ava considered this with her whole serious face. "Good," she declared, "'cause everybody should get to do the thing they're good at, even if they don't got a fancy shop." She looked at Victoria. "Right." Victoria Sterling, billionaire. CEO. The most powerful woman in her industry, standing in a two-bay garage on the south side of the city, with her makeup ruined and her whole life rearranged, looked at the 7-year-old daughter of the man who had shown her the truth about her own dead brother. "Right," she said, and her voice broke on it. "That's exactly right, sweetheart. Everybody should. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure more of them get to." She looked at Malcolm. "If your dad will help me." And Malcolm Carter looked at the woman who 24 hours ago had decided in 2 seconds flat that he was nothing, and who now stood before him, remade, cracked open, honest, holding out her hand toward a future neither of them could quite see yet. And he understood that the McLaren had never really been the thing that needed fixing. It had just been the small, overlooked part that once you cleaned it up, let the whole rest of the machine finally start telling the truth. "Yeah," Malcolm said. "I'll help you." And he reached out and took her hand, grease and all. And this time she didn't look down at it first, she just held it firm. The handshake of two people agreeing to build something, while a little girl watched from a doorway, and a dead man's honest machine sat quiet and perfect in the morning light, finally, at long last, understood. The story that ran the next morning was not the story anyone expected. Victoria had told the reporters to print it exactly as it happened, that 22 specialists had failed, and a mechanic on the south side had succeeded, and they had. But somewhere between the garage and the printing press, the story became something bigger than a car. Because the reporters had seen the little girl run across that garage screaming that her daddy did it. They'd seen the billionaire CEO cry. They'd seen the English engineer stand up in front of everyone and confess. And you can't witness a thing like that and write it up as an automotive repair. The headlines the next day didn't say anything about a McLaren. They said things about a man the world had overlooked. About what talent looks like when nobody's given it permission to exist. And the phone at Carter & Son started ringing and never really stopped. The first call came at 7 in the morning before Malcolm had even walked Ava to the bus. A young man, voice shaking, said he'd read the article and that he'd been turned down from 6 dealership apprenticeships because he didn't have a degree and didn't present well, and that he could tear down and rebuild any transmission you put in front of him, and nobody would ever give him the chance to prove it. And he just wanted to know if it was true. If a man like Malcolm had really done what the paper said. Because if it was true, then maybe he wasn't crazy for believing he had something in his hands worth believing in. "It's true," Malcolm told him. "Every word." The young man was quiet on the line for a second, and then in a voice that Malcolm recognized in his bones, because it was his own voice from 20 years ago, the young man said, "Nobody's ever told me my hands were worth anything, mister, my whole life." "Well," Malcolm said, "somebody's telling you now. What's your name, son?" That was how it started, because Victoria did not disappear back into her world the way Malcolm had half expected she might. He'd braced himself for it honestly. He'd seen it before rich people who had a big feeling in the moment and meant every word of it, and then went home and let the world close back over the feeling like water over a stone. He figured she'd send a nice check for the repair, despite what he'd said, and maybe a card, and then he'd never hear from her again, except maybe a Christmas card the first year, and nothing after that. Instead, she showed up at the garage 3 days later. Alone. No security, no assistance. Driving herself in a normal car in normal clothes with a legal pad and a look on her face that Malcolm had come to recognize from the moment she'd decided to fix her life, the look of a woman pointed at something. "I've been up for 3 nights," she said, walking in, no hello. "I have an idea. I need you to tell me everything wrong with it." "Good morning to you too. Malcolm, sit down. I'm serious. I need you to tear this apart the way you tore apart that car. Don't be polite about it. Find the corroded sensor in it before I spend a fortune building something that doesn't work." So he sat down and she laid it out. She wanted to build a school, not a fancy academy for kids who already had everything. She said she'd already thought of that objection herself. She'd heard him in her head. She wanted a training center, a real one, for people exactly like the young man who'd called Malcolm at 7 in the morning. People with the gift in their hands and no door open to them. People the industry had written off before it ever looked at them. She'd put up the money, all of it. She had more than she could ever spend, and 30 years of pointing it at the wrong things to make up for. "And I want your name on it," she said. Malcolm frowned. "Why my name?" "Because Sterling is my father's name," Victoria said. "And my father is the reason this school needs to exist. I'm not going to build the cure and put the disease's name on the door." She looked at him. "It should be Carter. Your father built a place with his hands and put his name over the door and never took it down even after he was gone. I want to do the same thing. Carter, for your father and for you, and for what you both understood that mine never did." Malcolm was quiet a long time. "You want to name a school after a mechanic?" he said finally. "I want to name a school after the best engineer I've ever met," Victoria said. "Who happens to be a mechanic? That's the whole point, Malcolm. That's the entire point of the thing. To stop pretending those are different words." But Malcolm, being Malcolm, had one condition, just like his father would have, just like his father did. "If we do this," he said slowly, "then I want it written down, in whatever official papers you got. I want it written down that this school is not for people who already got a way in. I don't care how talented some rich kid is. He's got 100 doors already. This school opens for the people who got none. The kid who called me at 7 in the morning. The girl whose hands know engines, but whose zip code means nobody'll hire her. The man just out of a bad situation trying to build something honest. Them. First. Always. You put that in writing in ink so that after we're both dead, nobody can twist it into just another rich person's school. Then I'll do it." Victoria looked at him, and slowly she smiled, and there were tears in her eyes. But they were different tears now, good ones. "Daniel would have said the exact same thing," she said. "The exact same thing." She wrote it on her legal pad, pressing hard, underlining it twice. "It's in ink. It'll be in the founding charter. It cannot be changed. I'll have the lawyers make it permanent." She looked up. "Anything else?" "Yeah," Malcolm said. "I keep the shop." "Of course you keep the shop. Why would you—" "Because Miss Ruthie's Buick still needs somebody," Malcolm said. "And the lady with the van full of kids. And the whole neighborhood. I'm not going to become some executive who forgot where he came from. I'll teach at your school. I'll pour everything I got into those kids. But every morning, I'm still going to open these 2 bays, and every afternoon, I'm still going to walk my girl to the bus, and I'm still going to fix cars for people who can't afford anywhere else. That's not a thing I'm giving up. Not for any amount of good you're offering me. You understand?" And Victoria, who 3 days earlier would not have understood at all, who 3 days earlier had built her entire life on the idea that success meant climbing away from exactly the kind of life Malcolm was describing, looked at him and nodded. "I understand," she said. "I finally understand." It took them a year to build it. They found a building, an old factory empty for years, on the edge of the same South Side neighborhood, where Malcolm's shop sat, because Malcolm refused to put it anywhere else. "You build it downtown by all the glass towers," he said, "and the people who need it won't come, because they won't believe it's for them. You build it here where they live, and they'll know." Victoria bought the building and the 2 lots beside it. She poured in more money than she'd spent on the 4 failed engineering teams combined, and this time she never once flinched at the cost, because for the first time in 30 years, she was spending it on something her brother would have been proud of, and Malcolm built the inside of it the way his father had taught him to build anything. Honest, solid, no showing off. Real tools, real engines, real machines that really needed fixing. He turned down the fancy simulators and the computer stations the consultants wanted, or rather, he told them to keep some, but not to make them the center of it. You learn a machine by putting your hands on it, he said. Same as you learn a person. The screen comes after. The screen always comes after. The Carter Automotive Trade Academy opened its doors on a cold morning in the fall. The first class was 30 students. Malcolm had gone through the applications himself, everyone at his kitchen table at night after Ava was asleep, and he had not once looked at a diploma or a test score. He'd looked for the thing his father had taught him to look for, the thing you couldn't fake and couldn't teach and couldn't buy the hunger. The person who loved the work. The person who'd been told no over and over and still hadn't let go of the thing in their hands. The young man who'd called at 7 in the morning was in that first class. His name was Terrence. He was 22, and he'd been turned away from 6 apprenticeships, and the first day of school, he showed up an hour early and stood outside in the cold because he was too nervous to go in until Malcolm found him there and walked him in with a hand on his shoulder and said, "You're not early, son. You're right on time. You've been right on time your whole life. World just kept telling you that you were late." There was a girl named Sophia who'd rebuilt her grandmother's car engine at 15 and been laughed out of a job interview at 19, when the man behind the desk assumed she was there for the receptionist position. There was a man named Curtis, 48 years old, who'd worked with his hands his whole life and never once had a certificate to show for what he knew, and who cried at his workbench the first week because he said nobody had ever handed him a tool, and said, "I trust you with this." There was a kid named Deshaun who'd been in trouble young and couldn't get anybody to look past it, whose probation officer had seen the newspaper story and driven him to the school himself. And Malcolm taught them the way his father had taught him. Not from a book. From the block. He'd put a dead engine in front of them, and he'd say, "Now don't touch it yet. Don't connect anything. Just look at it. Just get quiet and look at it and listen to what it's not telling you." And the students who had spent their whole lives being told they were the small, overlooked things, learned to find the small, overlooked things inside the machine, and learned in the finding something about themselves. Everybody's going to look for the big problem. Malcolm told them over and over that first year. The world trains you to look for the big, loud thing, but most of the time, the thing that brought the whole machine down is the smallest part in it, the one nobody bothered to check. The one everybody walked right past because they figured it was too small to matter. He'd hold up his thumb and finger an inch apart the way he had for Ava. And I want you to remember something, every one of you. The world walked past you the same way. Figured you were too small to matter. Figured you were the problem instead of the answer. He'd look at them, at all those faces the world had counted out. But sometimes the smallest, most overlooked thing in the whole machine is the only part telling the truth. Sometimes the thing everybody wrote off is the exact thing they needed the whole time. You remember that when you're under a hood. And you remember it when you're out there in the world, and somebody looks at you and decides what you're worth before you open your mouth. Prescott came too. That surprised everyone, including Prescott. He'd flown home to England after the McLaren, and Malcolm figured that was the last of him. But 6 months into the building of the school, Malcolm's phone rang, and it was Prescott, and he said in that clipped voice that had gone a good deal warmer than it used to be, "I've resigned from my firm. I've been thinking about what you said, about failure of imagination not being something you can get a doctorate in." A pause. "I was rather hoping you might teach me. Properly this time. And that in exchange I might teach some of your students the parts that do come from a book. The theory, the mathematics, the things I actually am good at." Another pause, more uncertain. "If you'd have me. I understand if you wouldn't." Malcolm looked out the window of his shop at the old factory being renovated across the way. "You willing to take your coat off?" he asked. He could hear Prescott smile through the phone. "I've thought about that night more than any other night in my life. Yes, I'm willing to take my coat off." So Prescott came, and he taught the theory, and Malcolm taught the truth, and it turned out the two of them together made something neither could have made alone, which was, Malcolm thought, more or less the whole point of everything. And through all of it, every day, Ava was there. She grew up in that school the way she'd grown up in the shop. She did her homework at a workbench now instead of an office chair. She learned the names of every student, and every student learned hers. And she became a kind of small mascot to the whole place. The little girl who'd run across a garage floor, screaming that her daddy did it back at the very beginning of all of it. The students loved her. When they had a hard day, when the world outside the school reminded them of everything it thought they were, they'd find Ava, and she'd say something with the total certainty of a child who had never once doubted her father, and somehow it would help. The years went by the way years do. Terrence graduated first in that first class and got hired by a race team, a real one, a good one. And the day he got the offer, he drove straight to Malcolm's shop and stood in the doorway and couldn't get any words out. And Malcolm just walked over and hugged him and said, "I know, son, I know, right on time." Sophia opened her own shop 2 neighborhoods over and put her name over the door and taught her first apprentice within the year. Curtis, 48, and finally certified, wept again at his graduation, and this time it was the good kind of weeping. Deshaun became a diesel mechanic and never got in trouble again, and years later he'd tell anyone who'd listen that a man in a grease-stained shirt had been the first person in his whole life to hand him a tool and trust him with it. Class after class came through. Hundreds of them over the years. The people the world had written off, learning to find the truth inside a machine and carrying that truth back out into a world that had told them they had nothing to offer. Every one of them a small, overlooked thing that turned out to be the answer. And Victoria Sterling changed, too. Changed all the way down, the way Malcolm had changed her that first morning without ever meaning to. She stayed CEO of her company, but she ran it different now. She started hiring from the school. She started looking everywhere she went for the people her old self would have walked past. She kept her brother's McLaren, and she drove it. Now actually drove it out in the world. The honest machine her brother had loved. And every so often, she'd bring it by Malcolm's shop for a tune-up, and she'd sit on a milk crate and watch him work, and they'd talk about Daniel, and it stopped hurting so much over the years, the way things do when you finally do right by them. "You know what he'd say, don't you?" she said to Malcolm one afternoon years in watching him work under the hood of the car her brother had loved. If he could see all this, the school, the kids, all of it. Malcolm looked up. What would he say? Victoria smiled, and it was a smile with no more pain in it, only love. He'd say, "See, Vic, I told you. The work is holy. It never mattered who was watching." She looked at the car, at the honest machine. "You gave me my brother back, Malcolm. Not the way I wanted him, but the way that lasts. Every kid that comes through that school, that's him. That's Daniel getting the chance our family never let him have." Her voice caught, but she was smiling. There are hundreds of him now, out there in the world, doing the work he loved, because of a car that broke and a man everyone walked past. Many years later, on a warm spring evening, the Carter Automotive Trade Academy held a graduation. By then, it had grown far beyond that first class of 30. There were sister schools in 3 other cities now, all of them on the wrong side of some town, all of them with the same words written permanently in their founding charter, for the ones everyone else overlooked always, and it cannot be changed. Malcolm was older now, his hair gone gray at the temples, his hands more grease-worn than ever, and he still opened his father's 2 bays every single morning, and Miss Ruthie's grandson brought the Buick in now, and Malcolm still fixed it for the same fair price, the same price he'd have charged anyone because the value of the work had never once depended on who was watching. And standing beside him on the stage that evening in a cap and gown was Ava. She was grown now. She'd gone away to school and studied engineering, the real kind, the book kind, the kind Prescott taught, and she'd come back the way Malcolm had known somehow. She always would because the shop and the school were in her blood, the way they'd been in his. She was going to teach now. She was going to run the academy one day, everyone knew it, and put her own name beside her grandfather's over a door. She stepped up to the microphone to speak to that year's graduating class, and she looked out at all those faces, all those people the world had counted out, and her father had counted in. And she looked over at Malcolm, standing beside her, gray and grease-stained and prouder than any man had ever been, and her eyes filled up. "When I was 7 years old," Ava said, "I watched my dad fix a car that 20 of the smartest people in the world said couldn't be fixed. And I wasn't surprised. Not even a little bit. Because I already knew something about my dad that all those experts didn't. Her voice shook, but she pushed through it the way she'd watched him push through everything her whole life. I knew that the world had spent his whole life looking at him and deciding he was small, the wrong shop, the wrong shirt, the wrong side of town, and I knew that every single time the world was wrong. Because the thing everybody keeps walking past, the small, overlooked thing they figure can't possibly matter. She looked at her father and then back at the sea of faces that had once been told they were nothing. That's usually the exact thing that turns out to be the answer. She wiped her eyes. My dad taught me that. He taught all of us that. And I want every one of you graduating tonight to carry it out that door with you and never, ever set it down. The world is going to look at you and decide what you're worth before you open your mouth. It's going to happen. It happened to my dad 10,000 times, and every single time he answered it the same way. Her voice rang out now clear and strong, and certain the voice of a woman who had never once in her entire life doubted the man standing beside her. He kept showing up. He kept listening when everyone else had stopped. And he refused. He flat out refused to let the world decide his value for him. The whole room was on its feet. Malcolm Carter stood there on that stage, an old mechanic in a grease-stained shirt, listening to his daughter say the truest thing he had ever tried to teach her, watching a room full of the overlooked and the counted out rise up and roar, every one of them living proof of the one thing he had always known and the world had always doubted. And here is that thing, the whole of it plain and final and true. The person everyone walks past is not the small problem. He is the answer they were looking for the entire time. And the day the world finally learns to stop deciding a man's worth before he opens his mouth, the day it learns to get quiet and listen and check. The small, overlooked thing everybody else ignored is the day it will find waiting there all along. The greatness it swore could not exist. Malcolm Carter proved it with his own 2 hands, and nobody ever got to tell him he was small again.